conmen, the most devious of all criminals. Charming, cool and calculating, they betray trust and devastate lives, yet remain a complete enigma. We are about to explore the intriguing world of these master criminals, giving an unprecedented insight into the workings of the complex minds of some of the world's most cunning conmen. In this show, we will dig deep to reveal the dramatic and shocking intricacies of one man's elaborate crimes and reveal how he was dramatically brought to justice. The story of Karl Hildebrandt unfolds like a best-selling thriller. A man who was a fugitive from justice for almost a decade. Missing and presumed dead after a faked suicide, he evaded the police on both sides of the Atlantic until a bizarre twist of fate exposed his ingenious deception and the disturbing and shocking truth behind his disappearance.
In my opinion, Karl Hildebrandt is an excellent conman.
Karl Hildebrandt's family probably went through a living hell, wondering what had happened to their son.
Karl's mother certainly believed that her son had committed suicide. She thought he was dead.
The mystery of what had happened to Karl Hildebrandt would remain unsolved for 8 years, with the conman and the law playing a complex game of cat and mouse.
He was obviously a very determined and inventive individual, really.
The police suspected that he'd gone to South Africa, but they had no idea where Karl was.
I wonder whether he views himself as maybe a modern-day Robin Hood. He takes from the rich and gives to a more deserving cause himself.
The story begins in South Yorkshire, England in the late 1980s. Karl Hildebrandt lived in Rotherham and was well known in his local community.
Well, Karl Hildebrandt was a member of a well-established family business in Rotherham. On the face of it, a thriving business. He seemed to be very ambitious and upwardly mobile and looking for better things, I think.
The Hildebrandt business was a bakery at the Tan Yard in Wickersley. It was a well-known bakery business. They had 4 or 5 outlets in the Rotherham area and appeared to be quite successful, a local family bakery. What happened, as far as I can recollect, is that Karl took over the business and it ran for a short period of time after that and eventually closed down. Karl then opened a restaurant, the Waterloo Well in Wiston, which is a village just outside Rotherham. That didn't last very long either. I don't know exactly how long, perhaps a year or something like that. I don't think it was very successful.
With the family business running into financial difficulties, it seemed that Karl Hildebrandt began making money by less ethical means.
He was allegedly involved in a very complicated DTI scam. He's one of 6 men who were alleged to have defrauded the DTI out of a couple of £100,000 in bogus grants and various other things. Very complicated and typical of the sort of thing that Karl seemed to get involved in.
The DTI scam Karl Hildebrandt was accused of was an elaborate scheme. He and 5 other men were arrested and charged with fraud. The accusation was that the men had created fictitious firms and businesses in a sophisticated scheme to fraudulently obtain almost £200,000 in government grants. Hildebrandt was released on bail due to stand trial in 1990. With an impending court case and the prospect of a prison sentence facing Karl Hildebrandt, it seems he had no intention of standing trial. Out on bail in 1989, Karl Hildebrandt and his then-girlfriend began to put the paperwork together to dramatically flee the country before the court case and then start a new life in South Africa. Karl Hildebrandt sold his Mercedes to a finance company for £28,000. He then promptly leased the same car back from them. One of the leasing conditions was that the car did not leave the UK. However, Karl Hildebrandt did not honour the agreement. He pocketed the profit from the sale and then stole the car. He took it to Belgium. The car was placed in a container along with personal possessions in the port of Zeebrugge, ready to be taken to South Africa. Phase 1 of the plan to start a new life abroad was completed, but Hildebrandt and his girlfriend would still need more cash to start their life overseas. and it appeared they had easy access to a lot of money.
He had a girlfriend at that time who worked for a Rotherham company, Nieser Eskefeld, who were a distribution outlet for grocery stores. She was quite senior secretary in there, I believe. 4 cheques were stolen from a chequebook belonging to the managing director of the company. Those cheques were made out for large sums of money, and eventually that was transferred into a sum in excess of £100,000. And those cheques were used to open a bank account in Leeds. Fictitious details were used, and it was never ascertained who actually opened that bank account. Well, the police suspected that Carl had opened that bank account. That's what they thought at the time.
There are a number of motives that con men employ in seeking to attain their goal. The one that we know most commonly is for financial gain, and we see this in the newspapers most often, where they've built either banks or individuals out of large sums of money. Another would be that they seek revenge or retribution because they feel they've been cheated in life and that they haven't gotten what they deserve, and they attempt to get that by conning others.
I think that we can all appreciate the law of a fast buck, basically. And so there's a series of decisions that people would go through when contemplating a scam. You'd look at whether you could get away with it or not, what you stood to lose and what you stood to gain. It seems that at the time that Carl Hildebrandt started his scams, he was experiencing some financial strain, and so that to him would have been an indication that he didn't have too much to lose, but he had everything to gain.
Well, everyone would have to search their individual conscience to decide if they felt strong enough to refuse a lot of money against doing something immoral and illegal. It's a calculation I guess that a lot of people make all the time, and they don't go down the criminal road.
Most of us don't lie because we're afraid that we'll get caught and we'll either be humiliated or punished. And con artists don't seem to have that same type of fear and anxiety.
Well, that money was used to buy a large amount of Krugerrands, which is a South African gold coin.
South African Krugerrands were first minted in 1967. Each coin contains 1 ounce of 22-carat gold. In today's market, 1 Krugerrand coin is worth in the region of £360, and Carl Hildebrandt was suspected of acquiring enough of them to live a very comfortable life in South Africa.
Well, I haven't counted how many Krugerrand coins Carl had, but he had £100,000 worth of these, allegedly. This is made of the finest gold, and these things are very, very expensive. At the time when Carl allegedly had these in his possession, they were worth over £100 each then.
With the police alerted to the stolen cheques and aware they'd been converted into Krugerrands, they began to connect Carl Hildebrandt to the crime. If their suspicions were right, his plan to leave the UK and head to South Africa was flawed.
I'm informed that Carl's mistake as far as these coins were concerned is that once you buy these coins in this country or any other country, you can't take them back into South Africa as a coin. You've got to change them back into the South African currency before you can take them back. This would ruin his plot because he would have to take a chance on being able to smuggle these coins through customs in South Africa, which probably would have been very difficult, bearing in mind that at the time we're talking about, South Africa was not a free and open country.
Carl Hildebrandt's trial date was approaching fast.
He was involved in other alleged financial scams where he was trying to obviously get hold of a lot of money with a view to skipping the country.
Well, the allegation, again, is that Carl was trying to sell these Krugerrands. Some of them were eventually recovered in a carrier bag in the back of a car at a garage in Mexborough.
Just a few days before Carl Hildebrandt and his then-girlfriend were due to flee the UK and fly to South Africa, the police made their move and caught up with them. They were arrested and interviewed on suspicion of theft and handling stolen goods.
Carl Hildebrandt was known to the police and therefore the press really because of his activities in some fairly dodgy financial dealings.
Well, he was interviewed on suspicion of theft of the cheques from the Nieser Eskefeld, the handling of stolen goods, which were the Krugerrands because they were the proceeds of theft of the cheques, the The car was found in Zeebrugge, so he was also interviewed for theft of that car, because that car, the Mercedes car, was on finance. And they also found documentation whereby he'd had a transit van on finance, and he'd actually sold that. They recovered that as well.
Now arrested and charged a second time, Carl Hildebrandt was facing 2 court cases, one for the DTI scam and the second for the stolen cheques. Things were not looking good for Carl Hildebrandt.
Having been charged with these offences, the girlfriend that Carl had at that time was granted bail. Carl was remanded in custody at Magistrates Court in Rotherham. His family offered to put up sureties for him, which were accepted by the court, and he was granted bail in the surety of 2 £50,000 sureties, with other bail conditions that he should reside at his home address and report to the police and sign the bail book at Rotherham Police Station.
But no one could have predicted Carl Hildebrandt's next move. Shortly after his family posted bail, Carl Hildebrandt executed his secret master plan that left the police, his family, and his local community shocked and devastated, creating a mystery that lasted almost a decade. In 1989, Carl Hildebrandt was facing charges of fraud, along with 5 other men. Before his day in court, Carl Hildebrandt had been charged a second time. He was arrested on suspicion of theft and handling stolen goods, after blank cheques were stolen from his girlfriend's workplace and cashed for £100,000. It was thought he was planning to use the money to leave the UK and flee to South Africa. He was remanded in custody until his family posted bail of £50,000.
The allegations regarding the original crimes, a lot of planning went into it. The opening of a false bank account, the preparation for flight, the car to Zeebrugge, all this was meticulously planned by Carl. So I would say he was certainly quite bright and did the job well.
In March 1990, just a few days before Carl Hildebrandt was due to stand trial in South Yorkshire, England, he stunned his family and local community by pulling a stunt that was to create a 10-year mystery.
He continued to sign the bail book for some considerable time. There became a time when he just didn't turn up to sign the bail book. He was circulated as wanted by the South Yorkshire Police for breach of his bail conditions. The date of his court date, where he was supposed to arrive for committal, that passed, and a warrant was issued from Rotherham Magistrates Court for failing to appear.
Carl Hildebrandt had disappeared. The search was on for the fugitive, but just 2 days after his disappearance, the police received a phone call revealing an unexpected twist in the tale. It seemed Hildebrandt would not stand trial. On the face of it, it appeared that Carl Hildebrandt was dead.
The next thing we heard was he was due to appear in court, and the police were saying that they'd found his car in the Humber estuary. He'd hired a car, driven it into the Humber estuary, with obviously the implication that he'd committed suicide.
With Carl Hildebrandt's car submerged in the perilous River Humber in northern England, the Humberside Underwater Police Squad was scrambled to recover his body.
We were called out to assess the situation. Arriving at the scene, we could see a partially submerged vehicle, and at that time we could only distinguish it was red in colour. It's not common, but it's not unheard of for people to commit suicide in this fashion. The search we did was wearing full diving equipment. I was elected as the diver on the day. I entered the water, searched in and around the vehicle to establish that there was nobody in the vehicle. Due to the type of water, the River Humber, there's so much suspended silt. There's no visibility whatsoever once you go under the water. So it was a case of searching around the vehicle, and in this event I actually removed the vehicle registration mark and came back up to the surface to enable me to read it. I passed that information on to my colleagues on the riverbank, and they conducted a police national computer check of the vehicle registration mark.
That car was traced to a car hire company in Parkgate, Rotherham, and the owner was able to confirm that Carl Hildebrandt had hired that car.
The police had directly linked the submerged car to Carl Hildebrandt. But the circumstances were mysterious, and while his family grieved, the police were suspicious. No body was recovered from the river, and the question began to emerge: what had actually happened to Carl Hildebrandt? Had the man facing charges drowned himself to avoid having to go to trial, or had he faked his death?
It had sort of connotations of Reggie Perrin to it, the TV series where clothes were left at the side of the river and Reggie was never seen again.
He was very much missing but presumed dead, and it was very much a story out of a thriller rather than an average Rotherham crime story.
It was believed that he'd tried to fool everyone into believing that he'd committed suicide. The police never ever believed that, but Carl's mother certainly did.
Well, few things in life are as painful as losing a child. And for a person to have that level of disregard for the feelings of someone who reared them is inconceivable to most of us in society.
Carl Hildebrandt's family probably went through a living hell, wondering what had happened to their son.
She definitely suspected that he had killed himself by drowning in the River Humber. She, in fact, blamed the police for that at the time. She was very, very upset about it.
They would have had numerous unanswered questions. Their life probably would be just a series of wonderings, you know, looking at people on the street. Could that be him? Where is he? Has something dreadful happened to him? If you don't have a body and you don't have the answers to those questions, you've got no closure, and it's very difficult for people to then move on and move forward in their lives.
What we know about grief is that it's easier to resolve the grief if you have the ritual, the funeral, the ability to say goodbye. And when there's no body and the person's presumed dead and just missing, their grief is prolonged because they always wonder, what happened? You know, was there something I could have done to prevent it?
Carl Hildebrandt's family may have believed that the River Humber in northern England had taken his life, but not everyone was so certain.
It was obvious from the police's attitude that they weren't at all convinced that that's what he'd actually done, and they seemed to be treating it as very much an attempt to escape justice. So from the outset, the hunt was on, basically. They were very much looking for a Carl Hildebrandt who was alive and well.
Carl Hildebrandt's actions in faking his own death, to me, appear to be the actions of a desperate man, a man who is panicking and is totally focused on himself and making a good escape. It takes a certain type of personality to be able to make a clear cut away from friends and family and just to start again under a new identity. You have to be quite a superficial person, quite a self-centred person to be able to cause your family to believe that you are dead and not take any actions to put that right, but also to be able to emotionally separate from people in such a sudden and shocking manner. And at no point did he try and attempt to make any kind of contact to put his family out of misery.
The police investigation obviously couldn't go any further until they could find Carl, because they'd gathered all the evidence they required for the prosecutions. There was nothing more they could do but to put it on hold.
The hunt for Hildebrandt may have hit a dead end, but this mysterious and dramatic story of a car being discovered in northern England's River Humber with no body inside was not going to go away.
The Sheffield Star, on the anniversary of Carl's disappearance, annually ran a story about it with a photograph of Carl and where is he now, that sort of thing.
Because the police never closed the case, and because they were always actively searching for him, and there were also various rumours that used to pop up. I mean, at one stage, apparently, he'd come back to see some mates and then slipped away again. I don't think that was ever proven to be the case, but it was a very strong rumour. It's the only case of its kind I've ever reported on, and not something that you would expect to report on in a court in Rotherham, basically. So, very unique. And obviously, from our point of view, you know, the local media, it was a great story. So we were obviously keen to keep it going. So we kept printing the stories quite regularly. The police were still hunting for him, reporting on the rumours.
And I suspect they ran that for 7 or 8 years.
In Carl Hildebrandt's absence, life in his hometown continued. In 1991, 4 of the men involved in the elaborate government fraud, allegedly with Hildebrandt, were jailed. Then, 5 years later, in 1996, Carl Hildebrandt's father died, not knowing whether his son was alive or dead. But in all this time, the police had not given up their search. Interpol had become involved in the hunt, but Hildebrandt appeared to have vanished into thin air. Almost a decade after his mysterious disappearance, whether alive or dead, it seemed doubtful that Carl Hildebrandt would ever be seen again. That is, until a remarkable and dramatic breakthrough that came directly out of the blue, 8 years after Carl Hildebrandt's disappearance back in 1990.
The real stroke of luck came one day when some bloke back from his holidays in America opened the Star, and there was a story about Carl Hildebrandt missing, presumed dead, with a photograph of him, and he realised that, hang on, I've been having a drink with that bloke, and it wasn't Carl Hildebrandt, it was Charles Staines. So told the paper, and that was that. The hunt was on again.
He was quite successful until he decided to mix it with a guy from Sheffield.
By pure coincidence, the police's instincts were confirmed. Rotherham's Reggie Perrin was alive.
Well, this was a great piece of luck for the South Yorkshire Police. They had no idea where Carl was, and here we had a guy from South Yorkshire who was telling them, and not only was he telling them what name he was using as well. Charlie Staines.
So he was living under an assumed identity, and that gave the police something more to work with.
We had no idea how he'd come across that name or why he'd assumed that name at that particular time, except that was the name he was using in Fort Lauderdale.
The name Charles Staines may have been a mystery yet to be solved, but for the first time in 8 years, in England, the Yorkshire Police finally had the breakthrough they'd been hoping for. But this was just the beginning. The police had confirmed their suspicions, but they had a long way to go. Locating and extraditing him from the USA would not be easy. Bringing Carl Hildebrandt to justice was still a long shot. But luck seemed to be on Brian Sutton and the South Yorkshire Police's side. In another twist of fate, they were contacted by a Florida resident, the disgruntled ex-girlfriend of Charles Staines, aka Carl Hildebrandt. The police were just another step closer to catching their man.
I had a stroke of luck at that time because Carl had allegedly been concerned with ripping off a British subject who lived in Fort Lauderdale. She contacted me, knowing that I was interested in Carl, which resulted in me talking to a private investigator in America by the name of Richard Stein, who was on Carl's case, if that's the term to use, and he was feeding me information about Carl on a regular basis, so I knew that he was using the name Charles Norman Staines.
Step by step, Brian Sutton was getting closer to trapping his quarry. As the investigation progressed, he discovered, over in the USA, the Fort Lauderdale police were well aware of a Charles Staines, even if the name Carl Hildebrandt meant absolutely nothing to them.
Charles Staines was a cunning individual. He was very calculated in what he did. He was very careful in what he did.
Carl Hildebrandt had inadvertently helped the South Yorkshire Police over in Britain with their quest. In May 1997, Hildebrandt, under his assumed identity Charles Staines, had been arrested.
He was initially arrested one time under the name Charles Staines. That was for a problem he had with his girlfriend, and it was a burglary and a domestic fight. He was booked under that name here in Fort Lauderdale in Broward County, Florida, as Charles Staines. Later, I become to learn through some information that he was really Carl Hildebrandt.
But Carl Hildebrandt, or Charles Staines as he was known in the USA, soon came to the police's attention for a second time. The Florida police connected him to an intricate and ambitious scam.
Mr. Staines had experience in the rental car industry, had worked in a rental car company for a little while, so he knew how the voucher system worked. He would counterfeit vouchers, and these vouchers were used mostly by travel agents. So if a consumer in the UK wanted to go on a trip, they would go to their travel agent, they would make a reservation for a hotel, an airline, and a rental car, usually at the same time, and they would get these vouchers. And these vouchers were like cash. They would be presented at the counter to the rental car companies here, and they would be given a car. So what he did is to make a little shortcut for the consumers over there. He counterfeited these vouchers. He would advertise in the local newspaper there of a discounted rate for rental cars. And the person would buy those discounted vouchers, use them over here, but he was getting to keep the cash in his pocket. And the consumer was turning in the voucher and getting a car. They would use the car for a week, 10 days, they would go back home, and the rental car companies never caught on to it right away.
Carl Hildebrandt had an opportunity when he went to America to effectively go straight, but he didn't take that opportunity. Rather, he took the opportunity that presented itself to him through his car rental company to actually start ripping off yet another big organisation.
I was pretty clever because the rental car companies hadn't caught on to it for a while. Matter of fact, when a car turns up missing, it usually takes them a little while to report it stolen, and most of the time, by then, the tourists that had these cars had returned them, and they had given up investigating on it, so a lot of them went unchecked. He actually did get away for about 18 months.
A lot of conmen do believe that they're a cut above the normal person, and not just criminals. They don't even believe they're criminals at all. That's a classic trait of a conman. Doesn't believe he or she is an actual criminal because they don't believe that what they're doing is true crime. They believe that they're just being smarter than other people, and well, they wouldn't describe it as taking advantage of other people. They would describe it as being smarter than the other guy, and if he's not smart enough, that's his lookout.
Now, it seems that there must be something intrinsic in this man's personality that makes it okay for him to do this. He obviously doesn't view it as morally wrong. He knows that it's legally unacceptable, but it's okay for him to do that. I wonder whether he views himself as maybe a modern-day Robin Hood. He takes from the rich and gives to a more deserving cause himself.
The money was going to good use for him. Mr. Hildebrandt liked to be in the social life. There were several clubs that he was known to frequent and hang out at. He had a few girls that he kept on the side there, but a lot of his time was spent doing his criminal activities and other elements. He was involved in other elements of crime as well. So he associated with people in different realms.
So if he even thought about it consciously, he may well have thought, well, you know, I haven't got the attributes to go straight, so this is the only life I know. And I think a lot of con artists do say that they find that they can't go straight and this is the only life they know, so they've got to stick with it.
With the UK and US police both closing in, Carl Hildebrandt's days on the run were numbered, and with his capture came the sick and devastating revelations of how he succeeded in dodging the police for almost a decade. And the answers were to be found in a graveyard. In 1990, Carl Hildebrandt was facing police charges of fraud, theft and handling stolen goods. At the 11th hour, shortly before he stood trial, he vanished. Missing and presumed dead, the local UK press crowned him Yorkshire's Reggie Perrin.
Well, faking your own death may be the ultimate con.
From our point of view, the story never really died because the police were obviously still actively looking for him and treating him as very much alive.
Well, it seems that the decision to move to America and assume a new identity arose out of panic because Carl had been caught trying to scam big companies in Britain. So for him to then start again in America tells me that there's something intrinsic in this man's personality.
Because con artists have an inability to delay gratification, they want what they want now, and they want it the easiest possible way without doing the work. So, for example, with Mr. Hildebrandt, where he came over to the United States and had an opportunity to sort of go straight and live a conventional life, he chose not to do that because of those traits.
While in Fort Lauderdale, Carl Hildebrandt was using the name Charles Staines, and the US police had linked him to a number of criminal activities. In a twist of fate, while the South Yorkshire police were uncovering what happened to Hildebrandt in the UK, over in the USA in 1998, the Florida police were searching for him in connection to a car rental scam.
The Fort Lauderdale police were on his case. A detective by the name of Russell Spies eventually arrested him. Carl was charged with criminal offences in Fort Lauderdale and remanded to Chrome Detention Centre in Miami.
Mr. Staines was arrested by virtue of a setup that we had done. We had some informants working that had asked to meet at a certain location, and they had invited Mr. Staines or Mr. Hildebrandt to meet at that location with this informant too. When he arrived, we were set up in many different positions with a lot of agents, and he was taken down in front of a business without any incident.
With the Carl Hildebrandt file now reopened in South Yorkshire and their attention focused on Florida, the American and British police began working together.
So I was told that he was a fugitive from England. So the only way to verify that was through his fingerprints. So I was able to contact the police in South Yorkshire, Detective Sutton. We corresponded back and forth. Eventually, he had sent me a copy of Carl Hildebrandt's fingerprints.
The positive identification came when I sent a certified copy of Carl's fingerprints from the date when he was arrested and charged for the original offences to Russell Spies in Fort Lauderdale.
We took them to our fingerprint examiner here at the Broward County Sheriff's Office and compared them to the previous ones of Charles Staines that was arrested on his separate burglary charge. They put the two together, and sure enough, we knew we had Mr. Hildebrandt. Mr. Brian Sutton seemed very excited to know that he has finally found the person he's been looking for a long time, and was very eager to provide me with any information, any assistance that I needed to ensure that this capture was made and that they were able to get their man back.
And now the US and UK police had solved their mystery, it was time to let Carl Hildebrandt in on their discovery.
Well, when after I arrested Mr. Staines and I told him that I knew he was Carl Hildebrandt, his reaction wasn't vocal in his words, but his expressions told all. He just lowered his head and closed his eyes, and I can see it all in his face that he knew it was over.
Well, often con men feel superior, and those feelings of superiority may increase the longer that they're able to engage in their scam. So when they're caught, it may be a crushing experience because they've assumed this new identity and they thought that they pretty much were scot-free.
With Hildebrandt behind bars in the USA, the game was up. However, there was one last piece of the puzzle remaining unanswered. Where had Carl Hildebrandt found the identity Charles Staines? An identity that had kept him safely concealed from the British police and Interpol's extensive searches.
Well, at that time, it didn't mean anything except that he was using another name. I was able to get the date of birth he was using, and as a result of that, we were able to find out that Charles Norman Staines had been a young man born in, I believe, North Ferriby in Humberside, who died at age 5 when he drowned in the River Humber, and Carl had assumed his name.
But as Brian Sutton began to probe further, the disturbing discoveries kept coming.
Well, what we found out was that Carl was in possession of 2 passports because he'd used another one, Dean Anthony Perry, on a trip to Guyana in South America. We also found out that this young lad Perry had also died in Humberside at about the same time, and it became apparent that he'd probably gone to a cemetery, found 2 young boys who died about the same age that he was, gone and obtained birth certificates, and then obtained passports, and it is as simple as that.
The idea to take a child's identity from a gravestone comes straight out of The Day of the Jackal, so it's quite possible that he got that idea from a book that he might have had on his bedside table. This wasn't the criminal genius at work, this is a desperate man.
We then went to the passport office in Peterborough, where we found the original application for the passport by the person who assumed the name of Charles Norman Staines, and the passport photograph was Carl.
At the point at which Carl Hildebrandt stole the dead child's identity, he was not thinking of the impact of that upon the child's parents. He was thinking about himself and purely about himself. I doubt that it would have crossed his mind. He just wanted to make an escape. To him, he probably felt that the child didn't need the name any longer anyway.
The traits of a good con man are Well, there's numerous ones, but I think the main one is a complete lack of conscience. Basically, you can't afford to worry about your victims, about whether or not you might have hurt them or if you've done something wrong or how they might be feeling.
The usage of the name of Charles Norman Staines, providing that boy's parents never found out, would not have been a problem to anyone. But of course, when we were pursuing the offences of the passport offences, it was necessary to visit the parents of Charles Norman Staines, who were very nice people, elderly, living in Humberside. Although it was a long time before, they clearly were distressed at the thought that we were making this investigation.
Well, the family of the person whose identity that he stole were likely very, very damaged by what he did. It's bad enough to lose a child, but when you get that phone call from an investigator or the police that someone has stolen the identity of this child that you loved and lost, it's a sense of violation to the very innermost part of your being, and such a sense of betrayal that it's very difficult to overcome.
The family of Charles Staines would have been immensely affected by the identity of their child effectively being stolen. Although the child doesn't need that identity any longer because sadly they're dead, they would have viewed that name which they carefully chose for their son as very precious to them. It would have represented their son who's not physically with them anymore. And so to have that stolen would be like having a physical part of themselves removed. It'd be tantamount to grave robbery.
In a letter to this documentary, the parents of Charles Staines said, "Even 40 years on, we grieve for our little boy. The fact that Carl Hildebrandt stole his identity is doubly painful, as we feel Charles's innocence was stolen and he can't rest in peace. Our son was named after his father and grandfather. Hildebrandt besmirched the name of the honourable men." The stealing of the names of dead people is the fastest growing identity theft crime in the UK. The UK's Passport Service now holds a database of babies' births and deaths dating back to the 1950s. So serious is the problem that they have produced a worldwide warning database with a total of 1,000 names of deceased babies whose identities may have been used by fraudsters. An initiative called Operation Wisdom was also launched in 2002, targeting people assuming the identities of dead children. Within the first 2 years, 255 arrests were made with 50 convictions. The Home Office have also introduced a new system where the 600,000 people who annually apply for first-time adult passports will have to take part in a face-to-face interview. This process will be extended to anyone renewing a lost, stolen or expired passport by 2009, making it much harder for people to inflict the heartache and suffering that Carl Hildebrandt caused to the Staines family.
What we do know is that these passports, the two passports that Carl Hildebrandt obtained, were applied for and obtained during the period that he was signing the bail book at Rotherham Police Station. So he was planning flight whilst he was on bail. It wouldn't have taken too long. I mean, I know from experience that you can fill the application form in and turn up at the passport office in Peterborough, and providing you've got the fee and you're prepared to sit and wait, they'll issue you with the passport there and then.
By 1999, the long-standing mystery of Carl Hildebrandt's assumed identity and location was finally solved. But with Carl Hildebrandt in US custody due to the car rental scam in Fort Lauderdale, the police now had to work out how to get him back on British soil to face the charges that he fled from almost 10 years earlier.
He stayed in jail for about a year until his trial date actually came about. The judge refused to let him out on any bond. He stayed in jail. His trial date came, and the judge decided to go ahead and release him on a condition that he get on a plane immediately to return to England to face charges that were awaiting for him there. And that was the agreement that was struck between him, his attorney, and us here.
Now acquitted of the charges in the US, Hildebrandt was escorted back to the UK to finally face charges that he had fled from 8 years earlier. But no one could be prepared for what was to happen when he finally faced justice. Carl Hildebrandt's story reads like a bestseller. He faked his own death and then stole a dead child's identity to avoid standing trial in 1990 on charges of handling stolen goods and fraud. Missing and presumed dead, Carl Hildebrandt fled the UK and started a secret new life overseas.
By the time the police found the car in the River Humber, it's possible that Carl had already gone. We're not certain because we have no recollection of where he went from and to, but he could have already gone by then.
It was almost 10 years after his mysterious disappearance that the police finally caught up with him in the USA. Carl Hildebrandt was using the name Charles Staines, but despite the intricate planning to escape justice in the UK, on the other side of the world, Rotherham's Reggie Perrin was still getting himself into scrapes with the police.
If Mr. Staines had not engaged in some criminal activity upon coming to the United States, there's a good chance he never would have been caught. Had he conducted himself in a polite, professional manner and done something constructive and real, he may be still walking around the streets here in the United States today as Mr. Charles Staines.
The allegation came over that he'd been arrested in Mobile initially for some sort of car crime. They bailed him and he'd done a runner again. He eventually got arrested by the police at Fort Lauderdale, a detective there by the name of Russell Spies, who dealt with him for offences connected with cars.
Was I surprised he was wanted in the UK? Not really, because I've heard so many stories in my 27 years in law enforcement, but it was just amazing that I actually got involved in a case like this, and it was quite intriguing once I heard the details of what had happened over there, and I thought, well, this is going to be a decent case to work, and it turned out it was. The judge said and agreed with his attorney and our prosecutor that he will be released now, only to get on a plane to fly back to England to face the charges that he had to face there.
With the UK and US police working together, August 1999 finally saw all their hard work pay off.
He'd already served about 12 months in custody. His time was served and he was brought on an aeroplane back to Manchester Airport by 2 officers from Crome Detention Centre. Carl came back to Manchester Airport at about 9:30 a.m. one morning. We went to collect him and bring him back to Rotherham Police Station. He was perfectly okay. He was very friendly and no aggravation whatsoever. It wasn't a personal thing between myself and Carl, but it did close a book as far as the South Yorkshire Police were concerned, because he'd been missing for 8 years and we got him back, so it was a closure.
As far as the police are aware, it was the first time Carl Hildebrandt had stepped on British soil in almost a decade. Now home, the family who believed he had drowned when his car was found in the River Humber had their son back.
For somebody who's got a very rich life and has got close attachments to their friends and family, the thought of actually faking their own death would be unthinkable. I think the fact that Carl was able to do this tells you that this is somebody who has got very superficial attachments to other people, is maybe very egocentric and really just focused on himself.
I don't know whether Carl ever contacted his mother during the 8 years he was on the run, but what I do know is that when we did eventually bring him back to Rotherham, she came and complained that we hadn't informed her that we got him and that she still thought he was dead. So the suggestion is he'd never contacted his mother or his sister. She was very distraught. She would have to be a very good actress to convince the police that she was acting, and I believe she was genuine. She thought he was dead.
And with Rotherham's Reggie Perrin back in the UK, it was time for him to face justice. Ironically, most of the previous charges that he had spent so much effort and energy evading were dropped. Carl Hildebrandt was charged with theft, passport offences, perverting the course of justice, and failure to answer bail.
When we got him back, a decision was made by the Crown Prosecution Service that they could not proceed with the original offences of theft of the cheques. The law had changed during the 8 years, and it was now apparently not possible to steal paper cheques. So they decided not to proceed with that, or the handling of the Krugerrands. So the offences Carl was recharged with were the the theft of the Mercedes, the passport offences, failing to answer bail, and perverting the course of justice. The perversion was that he'd faked his death and led people to believe that he wasn't ever going to be able to appear at court because he was dead.
In April 2000, 8 months after returning to the UK, Carl Hildebrandt stood trial, facing 8 criminal charges, although the prosecution did not pursue the charge of perverting the course of justice. At the trial, the judge, Peter Baker, described the case as a fascinating and bizarre story. He said that Hildebrandt's story read more like a novel than a criminal case. Carl Hildebrandt's mother said, "We'll all be happy when it comes to an end. It's gone on too long." After disappearing in 1990, leaving his friends and family to believe he had been lost to the River Humber in northern England, it is thought that Hildebrandt spent time in South Africa before setting up residency in the USA. And after running from the charges facing him in South Yorkshire for almost a decade, Carl Hildebrandt was eventually sentenced to just 15 months in prison. A local newspaper commented, "He need never have fled." Having served his time, he is now free and living in the UK. But the impact of the con, which draws parallels to Frederick Forsyth's The Day of the Jackal and the famous sitcom The Rise and Fall of Reginald Perrin, he will long be remembered.
These might have been the actions of a desperate man who was looking at a possible jail term and desperately wanted to make his escape. But he never, at any point in the 10 years that he was living under an assumed identity, tried to get in contact with his family to actually put that right.
I've never come across a faking of death and obtaining passports by deception before during my career, and I would say that it's not a common crime, although not too difficult to do. And what is also the case is that these 2 passports have never been recovered.
For somebody to live on the run for so long, I think you'd have to say that, yeah, he's a successful conman.
In my opinion, Carl Hildebrandt is an excellent conman.
Carl Hildebrandt was a cunning individual. He was very calculated in what he did. He was very careful in what he did, but like anybody else, they always make a mistake here and a mistake there, and it always catches up to him. But I think he was clever. He was very witty. There's no question about it. He was sauvé. He liked to play with the women a lot and get around, but eventually bad people always get caught, and that's our job, to find them.